Session 5 is going to be dealing with prospecting and procuring calls. And prospecting is one of the most important things we can do. I think we mentioned earlier that the most successful agents in our industry spend 80% of their time prospecting. One of the jobs of a sales associate is to not only to create but also to keep customers, and sometimes that's hard to do. And we're going to talk about various ways that we can keep these customers. One of the things that we have to understand that in the entire process of finding and keeping customers, first thing that we have to do is we have to prospect. We have to go find them. We have to be able to make our presentation. And then once we make our presentation, we have to follow up until we conclude what we need to conclude. In other words, if we're trying to get a listing, we need to stay with it until we get that listing. And let me say that prospecting, when we're prospecting, a prospect we don't necessarily know is going to buy or not. We have no idea, or if they're going to list their property or not. We won't know until we get that appointment. And one of the most critical things when we're prospecting, we have to get that appointment. Once we get the appointment, we can make our presentation. As far as what prospecting is all about, prospecting is going out and finding those folks that need our service. Developing leads, there's a number of ways that we can develop leads. But I think that if you really look at the big picture, it's a time-consuming process, and what we have to do is work smarter. If you know that a buyer is only kicking tires and you know that buyer's not really serious, you need to let them go. If you know that a seller is not realistic and is not going to change their mind about it, you need to let them go. You need to only work those things that are workable. And as far as lead generation, I've listed a number of lead generators that I think are very successful and they make your phone ring. Referrals, floor duty, real estate signs, print media, websites, sphere of influence, and open houses. Those are all things that's going to make your telephone ring. And let me say this, that if you're going to be successful in this business, you're probably going to have to make some changes in your life, and you're probably going to have to do some things that are uncomfortable. Some of those things that are uncomfortable will be productive for you later. And one of them is picking up the telephone and calling for sale by owners. One of them is going knocking on doors. There's a lot of things that we don't like to do, but it's going to be part of what we do in terms of becoming successful. Let's talk about the difference between prospecting and marketing. Prospecting is where we go to them. Marketing is where we do something that makes them come to us. So we have to separate the two. Oftentimes when we're working, we do both of them at the same time. But remember, they are two different components. So when we're talking about prospecting, telemarketing, again, what's telemarketing? Picking up the telephone and calling somebody. And also face-to-face. What's face-to-face? Setting open houses, going up and knocking on a door in your farm area, or knocking on a door for a for sale by owner or an expired listing. So those are the two ways that we prospect. As far as marketing, there's all kinds of ways to market. There's advertising, sponsorship, newsletters, the internet. There's all kinds of ways that we can put stuff out there and ask them to call us. Creative floor time is also going to be important, but you've got to make sure that when you're sitting floor, that if you're not on the phone calling somebody, do some other busy work to make sure that you get some things done. Also, you need to learn how to time block, and that is set aside time to complete certain tasks or to do certain things. In terms of lead generation, I've got to tell you there's a number of ways that we can generate leads, but probably the number one source today, I mentioned it earlier, is the internet. Internet leads are big. I think I mentioned that over 80% of the people that contact realtors start their search on the internet. And if you don't have a good personal website developed to be able to track that group, you're missing the boat, I can tell you now. Let's talk about lead generation and the internet. With that said, there are several ways that we can design our internet system to capture leads, and that's what this is all about. We're putting something out there hoping that somebody's going to respond to it so that we can contact them. The upfront registration is probably the least effective, and that's where that person has to register and give you all of their information before you give them anything back. I wouldn't do it, you wouldn't do it. Probably the most effective, or one of the most effective, is a limited result registration. And that is, they can go on your site, they can see stuff to some degree. They can see limited information. But if they want the total package deal, they're now going to have to give you certain information. That's probably a better way of doing it. There are some hybrids, and that's to say that there's some blends or mixes between these approaches. Also, one that's highly successful is the open search with a drip. And what that basically says is that they can come in anytime they want to and search and look, but at some point they're going to have to give you information. And let me tell you what this drip is. Somebody comes in and says, I'm looking for a house that's 2,500 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 3 baths, concrete block in this area. You can show them what you have, but if that doesn't fit their needs and wants at that time, you can say, I'll put you in the system, and every time that a new listing comes on the market that fits your criteria, we'll shoot it over to you by email. That's what that drip is. So there's a lot of ways that we can use the internet to our advantage. Qualifying buyers, and let me make a comment about qualifying buyers. There are a lot of qualifying sheets that we can use. We have to make sure up front that that buyer is willing to purchase. And maybe an easy way to do that is ask the question up front. Listen, if we can find that home that meets your family's needs and wants the most right now, and you know it, are you willing to make an offer now? That's all we want to know, because if they're not willing to make that commitment, what they may be telling you is they're not really that serious. So we're going to have to qualify the buyer. And let me say this, that qualifying from a lending standpoint is not necessarily totally qualifying a buyer. We can say that a buyer can go down to a lender and become pre-qualified and get a pre-qualification letter from the bank saying that they've been qualified for a certain amount. Folks, that is not a firm loan commitment. That pre-qualification letter isn't worth the paper it's written on. All I can tell you is that it's a very good first start. It tells us at least they've made the effort to go to a bank and start the process. Procuring cause, and let me say this about procuring cause. Procuring cause is the person that created the desire to purchase. And there's a number of ways that you look at it. You'll have to prove that you're the person that created that desire. And I can tell you now from my own experience, if 2 different brokers show the same property, whoever the person was that got the name on the dotted line is probably going to be the procuring cause. One of the things that I do know, that if a broker simply writes the offer and never shows it, that person cannot make a claim as the procuring cause. There are a number of codes of ethics and articles that the National Association has set down for us to comply with, for those of us that are realtors. And we talk about Article 17. And what Article 17 has to do with, if brokers have disputes over commissions, they're asked to go to an arbitration committee and let the arbitrators hear the case and make the decision. But I promise you, it's going to basically come back to exactly what we just talked about. They look at a lot of stuff, but I'm going to tell you right now, typically speaking, they're going to look and say, who's the one that caused that person to really want to purchase? And one of the biggest causes for procuring cause, buyers that jump from one agent to the other. In other words, a real estate agent who's working with the buyer looks up and all of a sudden they're gone. They're out with somebody else. And so if you do a study and you say, why do buyers jump from one agent to the next? I want to tell you what the number one reason is across the board. Buyers do not want to commit to one agent. They want the flexibility to pick and choose, and they don't want to be tied down to one person. Now, obviously, that may work for them, but in the big picture, I don't think it's really the best thing for them, because a good agent can handle everything. And what you've got to do is that you've got to secure a bond, and you've got to let them know that you can show them any property that anybody else can. How do you protect yourself when you're dealing with buyers to prevent yourself from getting into that procuring cause situation? There are a number of ways that we can go about trying to protect ourselves. A buyer-broker contract, that's one way. But I think that more importantly, the number one way that I would try to protect myself is sitting down with that buyer up front before you ever get started and having a heart-to-heart conversation about, hey, here's what this is about. here's what I can do for you, but here's what I want you to do for me as well. I can do everything that you need, and we don't need anybody else. And I can make any offer that you would like for any property that's out there. I think that if you don't have this heart-to-heart conversation, you're probably going to have problems later on. And you also need to stay in contact as much as you can. And with that said, that ends our session on prospecting and procuring calls. And what I'd like to do right now, let's review those things that we just talked about. The formula for sales performance is to prospect, present, and to follow up. Prospecting is going to the customer. Marketing is doing something to make them come to you. Approximately 90% of the customers who call realtors first start their search on the internet. Limited result registration customers can enter criteria and view limited information but must register before full results are given. Article 17 of the Code of Ethics requires brokers to arbitrate any disputes of commissions. The number one reason that buyers change agents is to be free to choose with no obligation. And having a heart-to-heart talk with the buyer about the process is the greatest way that we can keep our customers. And that's all we have for that particular section.